This is a presentation by COX Architects and Lovell Chen. We are jointly responsible for the delivery of the Wesley Place project. I think in talking about this project, I'll just lead in with some background on the heritage aspects and then hand over to Simon briefly. And the next image, just to set the scene. Simon, if we can click through. The Wesley Place project's based around the Wesley Church, located in Lonsdale Street in Melbourne. And the Wesley Church site in the next image is a foundational place, if you like, to the city. And in the 19th century, this stood as one of the major churches. It was part of the sort of grounding of the post-European settlement phase of the city. The site was one that when we started was very much a place of congregation, a place of gathering and worship. So this project, the site belongs to the Uniting Church. So this was a place that very much had its traditional role in that way. It was a place equally that had been long neglected. So we looked at re-engaging with the city and sustaining the place for the future. So this was about rediscovery, this project. The next one shows the nature of the place as the evolved place. And I think one thing to remember is that this is a place that has the church, has a schoolhouse, a manse, had other buildings on the site, some of which went long ago and some of which were removed as part of the project. So it is an evolution, and the project is about the evolution of the site. The project started by looking at the significance of buildings on the site. As you'd expect, it's a state-listed site, and the church, the old schoolhouse in the top left, the manse, and some trees, critically the fig trees and elms, were all seen as very important. And you can see the ground plane there in the 19th century. The site essentially was a revenue-raising site for the church. It was a secured site, entirely inaccessible to those in the city, and a site that was in an exceedingly poor state and had been for many years, and the general state of existing buildings. It was also a site that was very impenetrable. So this, as I say, was about discovery. The next slide, just the nature of the condition. When we started, the congregation at the church was 30 to 40 people. The Wesley mission was based there, and it had a very uncertain future. The church was looking at disposing of the site if it couldn't achieve some outcome. So the UCA, over a number of years, looked at potential for development. They saw it as an opportunity of reviving the site, but gifting the site in a sense back to Melbourne. And I'll hand over to Simon.
Thanks, Peter. So as Peter mentioned, the idea of gifting some part of the site back to Melbourne, the church had really three main objectives, really revolving around their level of service to the community, the idea of worship, so still acting as a church, and this idea of engaging back towards the city, this idea of city life that they really wanted to explore. The program for the project, as was briefed to us, around 60,000 square metres of commercial, 1,200 square metres of retail, so a mixed-use project. The site itself, 7,500 square metres, of which about half of that is accessible urban realm, with a small public space towards the north, Green Star and Platinum. We went through a process and collaborated with Oculus as well as Lovell Chen on this project of place mapping and place making early on the site to rediscover or to discover some of the elements that had been there for hundreds of years, that we could then maybe reuse and revisit. As Peter mentioned, this idea of rediscovery was really important. Our key objectives or ideas for the site, bringing the city in, how can we make sure that this site re-engages with the city, the idea of relife, and how can we create a new meeting place that then acts as part of the city fabric, and legacy for the church itself. Some of our early urban investigations where we saw really how to connect our site potentially to the laneways and the semi-public and public urban spaces within the city. As we further engaged with the City of Melbourne, we found their open space strategy actually identified this site as a potential for a green oasis in the grid. And now how our site really sits as part of that network of green oases, along with St Paul's, the State Library forecourt, City Square, and now Market Lane underneath Collins Arch. The site, as Peter mentioned before, the buildings are in disrepair, the olive tree sitting in the northern part of the site, and how it sits today. Our early concept sketches of bringing the city in, as I talked before about Lonsdale Street and Little Lonsdale Street, each have different characters. but sitting around the anchors that are our heritage buildings. An early concept sketch looking at the character that we started to identify and bring out in the site. So our commercial footprint sitting on the eastern edge of the site, the town square, the public space offering towards the north, the more contemplative spaces sitting through the flanks of the church, and the formal address of the site on Lonsdale Street, which serves both as a commercial address as well as our church address. The urban realm, public realm strategy, sitting there in a little bit more detail for the whole precinct itself, the city meeting place, the town square on the north, the contemplative and sanctuary spaces, and the meeting spaces to the south. Urban realm, as I mentioned, the site is accessible for half of the square meterage on the site, and also the commercial and retail spaces accessible throughout the day and evening. Our site is seen from the north, seeing the relationship between the Gothic Revival buildings and the new city square, the linkage, through site linkage that we've maintained through the site and connecting back towards the Lonsdale Street through to Little Lonsdale. Legacy, as I mentioned before, really important for the church that they maintain a presence on site. So they have about 7,000 square metres of commercial space within this building, a new public space that is really part of their legacy of developing this site, and of course the sinking fund that guarantees heritage protection ongoing. Our key challenges in the built form response are really how we maintain the prominence of the heritage buildings at ground level and how to connect them back to the city in some way. Our only viable development footprint sitting on the east of the site, our public links that we wanted to introduce to the site, our key formal moves that we made in the built form, where we carved away at the podium spaces to then reveal the spire and make sure that's received visual prominence from Lonsdale Street, the depression in the lower levels of the form and the flexing around the heritage buildings to give them breathing room and again amplify that idea of visual prominence. The view line that we've created now back to the church and opening that up to the street.
1 minute remaining.
The shots, and I'll pass back over to Peter to talk through some of the shots before and after.
This is just generally very quickly looking at it. So this was about delivering a church forecourt, the traditional church space, but also a place of respite. So the next image just shows part of this. Guiding patterns, we looked at drainage, at archaeology, at the patterns of landscape and storytelling interpretation. So it's very much a site about discovery and journey. Next one, I think, is the enclosure, the issue of fencing. Do you enclose or not? The rediscovery of the idea of partial enclosure. The next one. And the site, a place for congregation, both secular and ecclesiastical. So it's a very interesting combination of these two opportunities. And the final images of the contemporary forms and the landscape. And I think the next one.
Look, the connection back to the landscape and the heritage buildings throughout the building were really important from a heritage Victoria point of view. The formal spaces, and you can see the podium here reveals those formal spaces. The finer grain detail towards Little Lonsdale Street and our public square. Some of the gestures, our materiality acting as a monolithic backdrop to the heritage buildings, but also reflecting and amplifying how our building sits in the streetscape. Thank you.